Welcome, everybody. My name is Stacy Matrazo. I am the Executive Director of the Florida Wildflower Foundation. Um, Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Milkweed, Monarchs, and OE in Florida. It's complicated, and boy, is it ever. For those of you not familiar with our organization, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitat through education, research, planting, and conservation programs. Our work is made possible by the sale and renewal of the state wildflower license plate. These funds, along with donations and memberships, allow us to support and create projects that build awareness and knowledge of native wildflowers and plants throughout Florida. We'd like to encourage those of you who find our programs valuable to consider becoming a member, making a donation, or purchasing the state wildflower license plate. And if you purchase or have that wildflower plate, you're eligible for a membership. Just let us know that you have the tag and we'll get you set up as a member in our database. Be sure to check our website for resources on planting and growing wildflowers, to learn where to see wildflowers in bloom, for upcoming events, and so much more. We are also on social media. You can find us on most platforms at FLA Wildflowers. Our next webinar will be Designing Landscapes with Native Plants. That's presented on August 21st by Stephanie Dunn, an associate at Cadence Landscape Architects. She will share her knowledge and professional experience, highlighting the opportunities and challenges of using native plants in landscape design. Our September webinar, Natural Heritage Know-How, an Intro to FNA, will be presented by research scientist and botanist for the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, or FNA, Hannah Rosner-Katz, and that's Wednesday, September 18th. This webinar will give a brief overview of FNA's history and the role in Florida, as well as review some of the more botanically themed projects that are currently underway. For those of you in Central Florida, please visit us on August 3rd at Mead Garden in Winter Park, as we partner with our speaker, Dr. Jaret Daniels, and the Florida Museum of Natural History on a native plant giveaway. This event is free. Our local Native Plant Society chapter will be there giving tours of their sandhill and scrub restoration projects. Other native plant folks will be on hand as well. This is a first come, first serve event, so get there early to get your free plant. We do have some great field trips in the works, though we are taking a break in August. But for a really cool indoor experience, we encourage you to visit the Incredible Insects exhibit at the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville. This is part of their Science Up Close series, which gives you a look behind the scenes with real scientists in their lab. In this installment, visitors will encounter insect specimens and fossils, a live bug zoo, and an immersive multimedia experience. Incredible Insects runs through September 2nd, so get there soon. We are confirming our September field trip, so I apologize I don't have those details yet, but do keep an eye on our socials and our website for that information. In October, we're partnering with the Florida Native Plant Society and the Nature Conservancy to tour Tiger Creek Preserve on the eastern edge of the Lake Wales Ridge. If you've never been, this is an incredible gem in the heart of Central Florida, and we are looking forward to seeing some amazing fall wildflowers. Again, be sure to follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, or check our website, flawildflowers.org/events, and that will give you everything about our upcoming webinars, field trips, and other opportunities. I do have a couple housekeeping items to go over before we get started. All attendees are muted with cameras off. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature to submit them. Yes, the chat is active. You can use that, but we will not be monitoring it for questions. We will be using it to share any relevant links or any other information from the presentation. You must use the Q&A if you want your question entertained. We will address questions at the end of the talk as time permits. If your question is not answered, you can email it to us, info@FLA Wildflowers, and we will be sure to get that to our presenter. We will be ending promptly at 3 today, so we may have time for only a few questions, but we'll do what we can. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on our YouTube channel and our website in about 24 to 48 hours. When it's available, you'll also receive an email from us with a link to the recording, along with any resources from today's webinar. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Jaret Daniels is a University of Florida Associate Professor of Entomology and Curator Director of the McGuire Center for Lepidoptera and Biodiversity at the Florida Museum of Natural History. His research focuses on insect ecology, population biology, and conservation, with particular emphasis on butterflies and other native pollinators. And Jaret has been a longtime supporter and partner of our organization, so we are very excited to have him here today to talk about this, yes, very complicated issue. So without further ado, I will stop sharing and pass that over to you, Jaret.
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you all of you for joining today. It's always a pleasure to talk about anything butterfly related, and I just also want to say a huge shout out to the Florida Wildflower Foundation. They do fantastic work, so please support them as you can, and other nature-based organizations. We're at a time of really, unprecedented change on this planet, but Mother Nature needs all the help she can get. So with that, I want to give today kind of a 10,000-mile overview of kind of the monarch situation, really here in Florida and the deep south, and talk a little bit about the migration, a little bit about OE, a little bit about some other research that we've been doing, and kind of how it all intersects together, because as the title says, it is quite complicated. We of course know that the monarch is, this iconic organism. It's a beloved organism. It's kind of that gateway to all things natural, and one of the reasons that it is such this iconic organism, it's accessible. It's where we as humans live, in urban landscapes, rural landscapes, and it also has this amazing multi-generational annual migration with, millions of organisms moving to overwinter in primarily the mountains of Mexico, but also Western monarchs migrating and moving to coastal areas of California and Arizona as well. So it's just this unique organism that has a very complicated life cycle, and really a paramount, global phenomenon that is the migration of the monarch itself. It is, of course, an open area butterfly predominantly. It occurs in these open landscapes in proximity to its milkweed and milkweed family host. It's adaptable to a wide variety of other landscapes, agricultural landscapes, urban landscapes. It's found, again, where people live. And during the migration, of course, because it's moving across, really 3 countries, from southern Canada through the US to Mexico, it can be found in virtually any habitat during migration. So again, it's a very accessible organism, and one that we all see regularly in our lives. It does have a complex kind of history within North America. There are actually 3 kind of populations of monarchs. There's a small western migratory population bounded to the east by the Rocky Mountains that overwinters predominantly along coastal California, a few other places in the deep Southwest. And then there is some connectivity, some individuals that do make their way to the overwintering grounds in Mexico, although not a tremendous amount. So there is certainly connectivity east to west. There's a very large eastern population of monarchs, which is the one that predominantly migrates to the mountains of Mexico and to the Oyamel fir forest, and does so by the millions, hundreds of millions annually. And then there's a non-migratory population, the only non-migratory population in the US in southern Florida, and that's really poorly studied. It's a very data deficient population, and we'll go into some of the nuances of what that really means for the state of Florida. But of course, we also know, from a lot of media, a lot of scientific work, that the monarch has been declining over the last, 25, 30 years. This is, of course, a graph of the overwintering colonies in Mexico that Monarch Watch and World Wildlife and others monitor. And you can see that downward trend over the last, 30 years or so, from 1994 to pretty much present day. And you can see a couple things from this. One is populations are quite volatile from year to year. mediated by a lot of different factors, but that trend has been decreasing. And so that's the alarming kind of trend for biologists, conservationists, and the general public is, are we reaching a point where we really do have to worry about the monarch and its migration? And so those data points really precipitated in the petition in 2014 to list the monarch as a threatened species under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and also listed under the SARA Act in Canada as well. So this listing decision is still ongoing, and we expect to hear more from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. government in months upcoming. We also know that the drivers of decline for the monarch are complex. They're likely interconnected, and it's complicated again. There's been a lot of science behind this, many often pointing to different drivers of decline. And I just want to make a point that I'm just highlighting some contemporary work. I'm not saying this is the end-all be-all answer to this, but these are some larger kind of metapopulation studies using big data that have pointed to some interesting sort of relationships and trends. And so this is a series of publications that showed that the eastern population pre-2005, there was really strong relationships of the decline to loss of habitat, and particularly the loss in agricultural areas with the expanding use of Roundup-ready crops and glyphosate. And then post-2005, a lot of evidence pointing to climate change as a driver of monarch decline. And we can only, look into the future that climate change variables are going to be very impactful to the monarch and, of course, many other organisms and really life on our planet. And then the Western populations were more associated with land use variables than they were climate or habitat loss per se. But again, this is ongoing work. I don't want to present it as the end-all be-all. It's a continuum of how science is unraveling the challenges and the indications of what is affecting the monarch. And these drivers are, again, likely complex, likely interconnected, and synergistic. But I do want to really emphasize, and I love this quote. This was from a paper that Cheryl Schultz published as senior author. And it says, despite being one of the most well-studied insects in the world, many important scientific mysteries of the monarch butterflies remain, particularly regarding processes driving monarch population dynamics, the effectiveness of broad-scale conservation efforts, and human-related dimensions in conservation policy. And so this simply states that it is complicated, right? We despite as much research that has been done on the monarch, we don't have all the answers, that we are continually understanding more and more, and more information becomes available with each new study and each new data point. So it's a continuum of knowledge that is being generated for this very iconic organism. So let's drill down a little bit into the state of Florida, because arguably the state of Florida is complex, it's messy, it's challenging. And so what we do know is that there are really sort of three groupings of monarchs in Florida. There's the non-migratory population that occurs in South Florida. These are resident non-migratory butterflies. We have migratory individuals that funnel through from other points throughout the eastern portion of the US and southern Canada into peninsular Florida. Likely some of those fall out of migration and become residents in South Florida. Some arguably go to the Caribbean. Some may potentially even go across to the Yucatan. And there are others that go and encounter Florida and then go along the Gulf Coast and overwinter in the high elevation fir forest of Mexico. And then increasingly, because of climate change, a warming climate, and the use of non-native milkweeds that do not senesce, we are seeing winter breeding monarchs. These are essentially resident monarchs, but they're really not technically the resident population of monarchs. They simply breed year-round opportunistically because they can. And so that is kind of the messy nature of the state of Florida as a tropical, subtropical state, that we sort of have these three groupings of monarchs. And If you look at South Florida with the resident population, the resident non-migratory population, this is arguably the most poorly studied population of monarchs in the US. There has not been a lot of work on this. What is known is limited, and we do know that monarchs coming into peninsular Florida and those that are found in South Florida, a high percentage of these, about 48%, are actually migratory individuals that fall out of migration, breed, and become sort of, and often mate with the non-migratory population in South Florida. And so we know this from stable isotope data. We also know this from some kind of morphometric data regarding wing length, that migratory and resident populations differ. Migratory individuals are larger because they need to travel over a larger distance. Those that are residents tend to have shorter wing lengths. But again, it's complicated, and we don't know all the answers regarding the Florida resident population. We do know, however, if you go to North Florida and areas along the Gulf Coast, that those individuals that are coming back that we see in spring are predominantly from the overwintering grounds in Mexico. They're remigrating back to colonize portions of Eastern North America. We know this from a lot of past observational data, extensive cardinalite signatures that show where what larval hosts they were utilizing, and a lot of citizen science data as well. But of course, this is becoming even more complicated as the number of winter breeding monarchs increases along the Deep South owing to climate change and the use of tropical milkweed. And 35 years or so ago, a colleague of mine, Lincoln Brower, started a long-term study in north central Florida at a site in Cross Creek, Florida. And this is actually the longest standing return migration study on record, and my lab inherited this from Lincoln. And each spring we go out and we monitor Asclepias humistrata, pine woods milkweed, because this is a plant very important to the remigration of monarchs, because it's vegetative when monarchs are coming back to colonize peninsular Florida each spring. We monitor the phenology of this plant, and we also monitor the individual monarch butterflies and eggs and resulting larvae that are on this property each year. And not to get into the weeds, but this graph simply shows kind of when peak pine woods milkweed blooming is occurring, and also when they're setting seed. And this is important with the cycle of the monarch returning to Florida. And so this starts early in the year, in early March, even in late February, and continues till about the middle of May. And this is the first full generation of monarchs from that remigration coming back to Florida. But what the data also show is it kind of mirrors that Monarch Watch graph I showed earlier, that over the same time period from 1994 to present day, monarch numbers are declining in Florida. At least the migratory monarchs are declining in Florida. And this data really does mirror and is connected to what is happening in Mexico. We see this 80% or so decline. The abundance is not only just the adults returning, but the number of eggs produced is also a reflection of the lack of monarchs returning effectively from Mexico, and that these two things are interconnected. The decline and the numbers during the migration and in the overwintering colonies reflects to the monarchs coming back to Florida in the spring. And this is obviously, pretty straightforward. We would expect to see this trend. And so one of the potential threats to the monarch, and especially as we get to more resident monarchs and winter breeding monarchs and more proliferation of tropical milkweed, is OE, Ophriocistus electroscura. This is a protozoan parasite. It begins life as an inactive spore that needs to be eaten by the caterpillar. It then multiplies within the caterpillar and ultimately produces new spores that are transmitted to additional monarchs. And this transmission can have several different ways that it gets accomplished. One is vertical transmission, where an infected female will lay an egg on a milkweed plant, and during the process of that oviposition event, she sheds spores onto the egg and the surrounding leaf, which when her offspring emerges from that egg, it consumes those spores and reinfects itself. The other is environmental transmission, where a separate female lays an egg and another larva from a different parent consumes those spores and gets infected. And there's also some evidence that even during mating from male to female, that they can infect one another. So these are kind of three primary ways of transmission, mostly vertical and environmental, and then not a lot of information on transmission during mating. We also know that climate change is affecting the monarch and also OE in some very real ways, that as temperature increases, it affects monarch viability, and ultimately it will produce kind of smaller size monarchs, and monarch survival declines with increasing temperature, as does also OE virulence. So performance of OE and the monarch kind of both decline with increasing temperatures. And so we can expect to see that increasing global temperatures will have a negative effect on the monarch, but that might not necessarily entirely translate to a negative effect on OE, because it'll cause more resident monarchs and the expansion of those winter breeding or resident monarchs across the US. So again, it's a complicated intersection here, but warming temperatures are not necessarily a favorable landscape for the monarch. And so again, we can expect that there'll be further northward shifts of resident monarchs in North America. How this affects the migration is still to be seen, and it will likely favor more OE transmission and more negative impact of OE on monarch populations. And a lot of this comes down to this plant, tropical milkweed. This is arguably the most commercially available milkweed, at least across the southern third of the US, but it's available, of course, pretty much anywhere in North America right now. But it's most impactful in kind of the deep southern areas of the US, because it can cause impacts to the monarch, which we will go into. So it's a tropical plant. It grows like a weed. It does not die back or senesce like all the other temperate species. It's easy to grow. It's highly ornamental. It's often planted as ornamental. So we have to understand that this plant, it's not just us as monarch enthusiasts that are going out to buy a plant like milkweed, but it often is sold as an ornamental and grown entirely for that purpose. And it is often, as many of you probably see if you go to a big box store, it is often mislabeled as an ornamental or mislabeled entirely. I see this regularly throughout Florida, that this plant is labeled as Asclepias incarnata or tuberosa, when of course it is not that species. And it's even more than this plant. We know that there are two other non-native milkweeds that are pretty widespread in the ornamental trade, and this is giant milkweed and swan milkweed. And actually, swan milkweed is rated by UF-IFAS as a high invasion risk species. So we don't really know how these other two milkweed family plants are impacting the monarch and survivorship ultimately of the monarch, even on these plants overall. But what we do know is that in areas where monarchs don't migrate, where they are resident, where they continuously breed, it increases OE, infection, transmission, and local population impacts. This likely disrupts the fall migration potentially, because as monarchs encounter tropical milkweed, many fall out of migration. They become reproductively active again and breed on tropical milkweed. And there's been some really great work by Sonia Altizer and others out of the University of Georgia that have shown this. It increases the likelihood of winter breeding. It increases the likelihood of death due to inclement weather, because again, if these plants are grown in areas where frost or freezes happen, and you have larvae on your plants at that time, your plant is toast, your larvae are toast. It also, there are many other dangers regarding the production of this plant due to systemic insecticide use and the usability of these plants for monarch larvae in the short term. There's also some negative aphid-monarch interactions, which I'll go into regarding this plant. And again, the fact that it also makes things very complicated for the public, because it's often misused mislabeled as a native. And so this creates a lot of confusion on the consumer side and the public side. And so when OE levels build up to a high level in resident monarch populations due to this plant, it can cause really severe impact to the monarch. They may die outright, or they may have some sublethal effects, which really affect the monarch fitness and ability to migrate. And so this is kind of a vicious cycle where it's having a net negative impact to the monarch and to monarch populations. And so tropical milkweed and OE are sort of interconnected to one another with this issue. We also, of course, know that concentrations of cardenolides, the toxic chemical within milkweed plants, varies widely across milkweed species. It's also an inducible defense. So the more it's fed upon, the more the plant responds by increasing the levels of cardenolides within the plant. And also temperature affects the cardenolide level. So in higher temperatures, you have plants that produce higher levels of cardenolides to the point where some of these plants can actually become unusable by the monarch. And so that's another potential danger with tropical milkweed under climate change scenarios, that increases the likelihood of monarch-related impacts and reduces monarch fitness on tropical milkweed as well. And so some of the potential arguments for not using tropical milkweed and how OE affects this in an interconnected way is that in highly urbanized areas where you have a lack of native milkweeds or milkweeds generally across a broad area of the landscape, you're concentrating milkweeds into urban landscapes, yards, neighborhoods, often non-native milkweed. These create potentially hotspots for monarchs to use the plant. And again, they're using a non-native predominantly. And ultimately, it builds up infection rate of OE in these hotspots, which aid in increased transmission of OE. So this has been the predominant argument why we should limit tropical milkweed use, or potentially even any milkweed use in urbanized landscapes. I don't necessarily agree with the limiting native milkweed in urbanized landscapes, but I think there's a lot of credibility to minimizing or limiting or abandoning the use of tropical milkweed as an entire organism for entire plant for landscape use in particularly urban areas because of the negative impacts. However, I would argue that planting native milkweed can actually have the opposite effect on OE as you increase the number of milkweeds across the landscape writ large in a highly complex landscape from urban to rural landscapes. You're creating more resources for the monarch. You're creating more dynamics and complexity of that landscape overall, and you're sort of having a dilution effect on OE concentration. So I would always argue for choosing native milkweed, planting native milkweed when you can, avoiding tropical milkweed because of the many, many potential threats, including OE use overall, or OE infection overall. And so again, just to emphasize that if you compare native to non-native milkweed, whether it's tropical milkweed or other non-native milkweed family plants, that over the life cycle of the monarch during a calendar year, the challenges of non-native milkweed are that it can cause continued reproduction, disrupt the migration of the monarch, yield to increased mortality due to freeze and frost events, and also systemic insecticides on these plants that are produced in high scale for public use in ornamental landscapes. But I will say that there's a lot of questions that we as scientists still have. And this was a really great paper that came out not too long ago. And it outlined a number of key questions regarding the impact of winter breeding and also OE and tropical milkweed. And these, I won't go into each of these in detail, but I would encourage you just to look at these for a minute, because there's a lot of questions that we still want to have answers to. For example, where do all these winter breeding monarchs originate from? Are some coming from existing winter breeding populations within Florida and Deep South? Are all of these falling out of migration from points further north? How is climate change affecting the timing migration and the onset of this winter breeding? Can winter breeding populations potentially rescue migratory populations if there are catastrophic effects in the overwintering grounds in Mexico due to climate-related events? So there's a lot of complexity and a lot of questions yet to be answered. So I want to kind of round this webinar up a little bit by talking a little bit about the other side of tropical milkweed, and that is the nursery production of milkweed, and another reason to potentially not use tropical milkweed in urbanized landscapes. As I mentioned, it's the most commercially available milkweed that you can buy, from big box stores to nursery centers and garden centers overall. And we've done a lot of work on the impact of tropical milkweed and the monarch, using this as a model system to understand how insecticide use could really affect the monarch as a non-target organism, and also trying to give growers a viable way that they can ultimately deliver high quality, viable pest control on their plants without affecting or minimizing the effects on monarchs. So one study that just came out that was published that you can see also in Entomology Today was one looking at the use of insecticide use and its effect on aphid control on plants and also on non-target impacts of the monarch. And just to say that we investigated a number of different potential insecticides. Most of these were systemic insecticides that are incorporated into the tissues of the plant to render high efficacy for aphid control, which is the predominant insect pest on milkweeds during high-level production. But we also investigated, alternatives like insecticidal soap, which are widely available and considered predominantly non-overly toxic to the monarch. And what we found in general is that many of these systemic insecticides were good at knocking back aphids on milkweeds, but only for a very short time. So in this series of graphs, the orange kind of line is the kind of aphid load on these plants. The blue line is chronic mortality of monarch caterpillars on these plants. And that kind of green bar along the side is the threshold level of effective or viable aphid control that would be acceptable to a grower producing milkweeds. And so what you can see kind of as a takeaway here is that many of these insecticides knock back aphids quickly, but they quickly rebound to high threshold levels that are non-acceptable to growers. And almost all of these, with the exception of only two, have or generate really acute, long-lasting mortality to the monarch, even longer mortality than aphid efficacious control. So monarchs in many ways are more sensitive to these chemicals on plants than are aphids. So this is a challenge, right? Because we need to provide good quality pest control, but we don't want to we want to minimize impact to the monarch and that non-target organism. So the challenge here is, what can we do to provide this type of control that will render plants usable by the monarch and not have a negative impact? Because right now, what we're seeing in the market is that growers need to provide control. And so those plants that are readily available at big box stores are often unusable for monarch larvae for a period of time. And so we don't want these plants planted in landscapes becoming ecological sinks, doing more harm than good to monarch populations, when the whole reason or the dominant reason people are including them in their landscape is to help with monarch conservation. So we're continuing to evaluate alternative chemistries and looking for other even mechanistic ways where we can recommend to growers that will help to minimize impacts to the monarch. We also looked at this from a kind of an upside down way and saying that, one of the biggest or one of the most frequent questions we get is, what do I do when I have aphids on my plants? How do I control aphids effectively without impacting monarchs? And so we wanted to know actually how impactful were aphids themselves on monarchs and the use of monarchs by heavily infested plants. So we looked at this from an ovipositional point of view, from a monarch survival point of view, and from a long-standing sort of non-lethal effect on the monarch point of view. So what we found is we compared plants that were free of aphids, those that had moderate aphid infestations, and those that were heavily infested with aphids. And what we found is that female butterflies predominantly selected plants that had lower aphid loads or no aphids for what plants they chose on which to lay their eggs. And then maybe even more impactfully is that monarch mortality went way up on heavily infected aphid load plants, predominantly because, or likely because, this is an inducible defense. As this plant is stressed because of the high aphid load, it's pumping out more higher level of cardenolides, which ultimately potentially have a negative impact on the monarch. And then maybe even more devastating is the fact that even those monarchs that survived on heavily infested aphid load plants had lower fitness. They were smaller individuals, which render them less fit for long-term migration. So my sinuous story here is that it's not just the chemicals, it's not just the OE, it's the complexity of the interrelation of all these things. And even aphid load alone can have really serious negative impacts on the monarch. So this is another reason predominantly not to use tropical milkweed, because a lot of native milkweed populations and plants don't have as high a propensity for aphid infection than, or aphid outbreaks than do tropical milkweed. So again, just to kind of summarize here, that planting native milkweed is the recommendation, because again, many of these don't have the same proclivity for aphid load impacts. Using highly selective products like systemic insecticides do not necessarily mean they're not going to have impact to the monarch. But it's not realistic for growers to use no chemicals at all. So we're still trying to drill down into best practice recommendations for growers on how we can kind of intersect to providing efficacious pest control and minimize non-target impacts to the monarch. Of course, we want to make recommendations to not plant tropical milkweed, at least north of Lake Okeechobee. We want to plant native milkweeds whenever we can. And I know the complexity there is that it's hard for people to get native milkweeds, and oftentimes they don't grow very well in home, especially urbanized landscapes. So this is something that we all have to work on in increasing the availability and kind of knowledge base out there to make people realize that native is good. And they're available, and get growers to buy into this, that they need to produce more native milkweeds. And that if you don't have the opportunity to buy native and you still want to use tropical milkweed, a few caveats is that if you live north of Lake Okeechobee, our best recommendation is to basically cut it back to the ground around Halloween, late October, kind of force it to senesce, and don't make it vegetative or allowed to be vegetative until late February, when monarchs are recolonizing peninsular Florida from Mexico each year. So you're essentially forcing it to not be available when monarch migration is happening, and when monarchs could be highly susceptible to freeze and frost events in Florida. Avoid, where possible, pesticide-treated plants. And I know this is challenging, but my best recommendation is to first and foremost ask a nursery professional, has the plant been treated? If they don't know, then the best thing you can do is use your eye test. If you see the plant as being entirely pristine, there's no insect feeding damage, there's no other insects on that plant, assume the worst. Assume that for a period of time, this plant is non-viable for monarch feeding to be utilized by larvae. So you can avoid that plant entirely. You could buy that plant and sequester it for a few weeks and hope for the best. But the best thing is to buy from reputable sources where you know the plant has not been treated with insecticides as much as you can. And then lastly, and I know this is often a controversial topic by people that are very passionate, but don't rear monarchs indoors if you can. Watch monarchs out in the environment, watch them in your landscape, enjoy them in those settings. Don't try to overly protect them from predation. Don't rear them in large numbers indoors, because there is a lot of data showing that larger scale breeding of monarchs really doesn't have a significant conservation impact, and it actually has several negative potential impacts. One is that when raised indoors, monarchs are not getting those environmental cues that they need. So they can be kind of ill-timed and less connected to be able to orient appropriately southward during migration in the fall. We also know that larger scale breeding can transmit disease, not just OE, but viral infections, and lead to high level mortality. So generally, again, enjoy monarchs out in your landscape in natural environments. You can rear them in small numbers, but don't go hog wild on this, and realize that the choices that you make in your landscape impact the monarch, and realize that instead of saying, I want the monarch in my yard year round, think about what is best for the organism, and try to think always with a monarch-centric view, that our goal as environmentally minded citizens is to try to do our best for conservation, not just the monarch, but of other insects, pollinators, and other wildlife around, and try to kind of share that message with others as much as possible. So with that, I'll say thank you. The work that I presented was supported by a lot of different funders, including the Florida Wildflower Foundation, and a lot of great collaborators, including my lab and other labs here at UF and beyond. And just to say that it's complicated, we continue to learn more all the time. And the recommendations here are simply recommendations. They're not the letter of the law. I'm simply trying to clarify some issues and ensure that we try to do the best we can for monarch conservation work long term. So happy to answer any questions that you may all have at this time.
Oh, we have lots of questions. And again, we're going to wrap up at 3. So if your question's not answered, we are capturing them, and we will make sure that we get a response to you. I'm going to start with 2 questions that are kind of in the same vein. Regarding the native milkweed that does not die back, Asclepias perennis, one of our swamp milkweeds, does that pose the same issues as tropical milkweed since it doesn't die back? And a follow-up question to that, or similar, is that we have someone who's saying they have incarnata planted, but it's not dying back. Is that an issue as well?
Yeah, so that's a great series of questions, Stacy, and I will answer that as best I can. So I'll say that it's not fully understood, but I will point to the work that Sonia Altizer did, and where she presented migratory monarchs with native milkweed and tropical milkweed. So these are plants that would be were grown under conditions where they would be seasonally appropriate. And so when monarchs encountered Asclepias incarnata, which was the target plant that she had, they did not fall out of migration. They did not become reproductively active again and breed, or at least not a high percentage of them did. Comparatively, with tropical milkweed, a higher percentage, a much more significantly higher percentage, did fall out of migration and become reproductively active again and use that plant. So undoubtedly, there have been, we can't go back in time to really, look at this question, but undoubtedly there are milkweeds, especially along the Gulf Coast, that don't always die back, and that probably does cause some periodic winter breeding, but it's not at a scale that's alarming and impactful to the migration like tropical milkweed would ultimately be.
Great. This is one I'm curious about too. Are there any insights about whether or not monarchs are adapting to OE infestations, if they're developing any resistance, or are we not seeing that?
I don't know of any data showing that. I know monarchs can self-medicate, and they often seek out plants that have higher cardenolide levels like tropical milkweed, and that has been shown to reduce some of the negative effects of OE at a local population scale. So, that's really a unique adaptation and a way that a monarch's sort of self-treating these sort of high-level infection rates. I think, again, the worry is that we're concentrating monarchs in urban cores. We're using tropical milkweed, which generally causes, resident monarchs, or at least non-migratory breeding. So we're significantly impacting how OE would naturally interact with the monarch, and so there's the concern.
And we have a couple questions about giant milkweed. If you have any information on how is it an OE issue? And again, similar to that, I know it's being used a lot in South Florida in particular. What are aside from the invasive potential, what are the other concerns about these plants?
Well, I think just so there's not a lot of information comparing how monarchs choose or survive on some of those other non-native milkweed family plants. So I think there needs to be more research on, if you compare tropical milkweed, giant milkweed, swan milkweed to native milkweeds, is there a difference of monarch usage and monarch survivorship on those plants? Are we setting monarchs up some way to fail in these highly urbanized spaces where they become more sinks than sort of producers of monarchs back into the environment? So there does need to be more data on that. We don't know how these other milkweeds affect migratory monarchs, whether it has the same effect like tropical milkweed, whether they encounter these plants, will they fall out of migration more and are more likely to use these plants. But they are increasingly becoming commercially available. I mean, swan milkweed is, really rapidly becoming available, and that one, is of concern because of its invasive potential. And I think it's just complex, but we need more data.
And on that, since it is tends to be more, well, I don't know. I've seen it a lot in South Florida, and I hear a lot of people in South Florida utilizing it. Are there milkweeds, native milkweeds, that you would recommend for South Florida that would be supportive of monarch, particularly because there are resident populations down there?
Yeah, it's always a tough one, right? I mean, certainly, Incarnata does get down there a little bit. Perennis is probably the better choice for South Florida, but there's so many people that say those plants just don't work well in South Florida, and tropical milkweed is such a go-to plant because it grows so well. It's so easy to grow. It has, it's just ubiquitous. But it, again, it's escaping too into natural environments, which is also a concern. So the best thing I can say is try to use native milkweeds, some of those species where you can. And I think we're less concerned generally about OE and tropical milkweed in South Florida, where it's not really, those populations are not directly connected to the migration of the monarch. And so I think there's a little bit of wiggle room there. I think where we're most concerned is Central and North Florida, where the impact could really be on harming monarch populations and disrupting the migration writ large.
Have there been any studies, or do you know of other butterflies, particularly in the same family as the monarchs, or the same genus for that matter, of getting OE? Are they at risk of being infected by that as well?
So we do know from research from other scientists that OE is pretty ubiquitous to all monarch family butterflies. So there was some work looking at sampling in collections of all Danaus butterflies, a subfamily that is monarch family butterflies, and almost all those had OE. So it is common to that subfamily, but I think we don't know, or at least I don't know, whether some of the same impacts are on some of these other taxa, but predominantly those are mostly tropical taxa, not like temperate taxa like the monarch. I mean, monarch's a tropical butterfly, but they don't have that seasonal mass migration like the monarch.
We have a couple questions about rearing butterflies, rearing monarchs. Is the We don't want to bring them indoors. You've been clear about that, but netting over the plants outside, butterfly houses that can be used in the yards, are those still problematic?
Uh, so, uh, uh, so again, take this with a grain of salt. I mean, I know everybody's passionate about protecting their larvae and their landscape, and it's hard to see things being eaten by other organisms, but that is part of the role of insects. They're food for so many other forms of wildlife, insects, birds, and we have to be mindful that we can't protect everything, and by doing so, we actually could potentially harm the monarch by concentrating them into areas where they're too overcrowded and they're going to transmit disease, OE or other diseases, and or produce monarchs that are just not as fit as monarchs produce naturally in the environment. So, use it with caution. Certainly, I think netting plants is viable. I think my point was really like not large scale mass rearing of monarchs. And there's a lot of people that do this and share it with a badge of honor. I produced 5,000 milkweeds monarchs last year, and I think there's more danger to that. So again, take it with a grain of salt. Try to enjoy monarchs in their natural environment. If you feel the need to try to protect them, do so at as much as you can, but be mindful that larvae are going to be eaten, and that's part of the natural cycle of things.
We have a couple of questions. I'm going to try and roll into one here about commercial availability or commercial growers of tropical. One question is, how receptive are commercial growers to curtailing that production? What can we do? And given that it is so prolific in particularly our big box nurseries, is it here to stay? Are we
So
doomed? The question is.
Yeah, so I do kind of think it's here to stay because it is grown predominantly as an ornamental. I mean, that's still the dominant market versus, say, for the monarch butterfly. But I think what we can do is, growers are very receptive to trying to minimize the negative impacts of chemicals on non-target organisms like the monarch. And so they're very receptive, and growers are not the enemy here. It's trying to get good information out to the public. It's trying to work with growers to grow them in a responsible way, to make those that are available less toxic to monarchs because of the chemicals used on those plants. And it's also just getting, like I said, information out to the public, and always try to encourage people to buy native where possible, and to work with growers to bump up the native production of plants more effectively, because historically Lowe's, Home Depot, other big box stores regularly produced incarnata and perennis and tuberosa, and I think we can get to large scale production of those native plants again. So I think it's just sort of continuing having that as the end goal.
And the market needs to demand as
It
well.
does, it does. And I think there's so much misinformation out there. We need to do a much better job of educating the public on what are the best practices, and then working with growers, because they're very receptive, and they want to do the best they can because it's their market too, and they understand the need for doing so responsibly.
So again, wrapping a couple questions into one, is there any possibility of an OE resistant cultivar? Is anyone working on that? And similarly, is there anything that might kill the parasite that wouldn't harm the insect?
Yeah, so OE is a parasite of the butterfly, not the plant, and so a cultivar would not necessarily affect that. Regarding other ways of treating OE on monarchs, that's out of my area of expertise, but I think that's it's highly unlikely, because again, how that would have to be rolled out in a such an extensive landscape would almost be impossible.
Back to South Florida. Would you recommend perennius over incarnata for South Florida?
I would, yeah. I think it's more widespread in South Florida.
Does
I think those are
incarnata
the
doesn't.
two mostly, the most useful species kind of broadly. I mean, tuberoses, you get to northern Florida. I mean, tuberoses in South Florida too, but it's a harder plant to grow. I think the easier plants to grow are incarnata and perennis. They look very similar. They can be grown in containers as well as in natural or urban landscapes, natural landscapes. So I think they're probably the best choice ultimately, but it's probably not the answer anybody wants to hear.
I don't think anyone wants to hear that. Well, there's a lot of disconcerting realities here that we have to deal with. In Central Florida, this is an Orlando question in particular. The question is, are we ill-advised to try to plant for monarchs? Do monarchs even belong here in this part of the state?
I think they do. I mean, there's certainly evidence that monarchs migrate into Central Florida. Where they go from there is maybe less poorly understood. I think a lot of them do end up as non-migratory individuals. It's a dead end for monarchs, but I think there's still the possibility some do migrate across to the Yucatan or so I don't think it's a bad thing. And I will say that from a point of view that milkweed plays so many other roles in the environment. It's not just the monarch. I think we often need to decouple native plants and that to just focus on one organism, right? Many other insects and use milkweed, many other insects nectar on milkweed. So it's more than just the monarch. And I think that we have to look at a totality and the holistic nature of what native plants mean to the world in which we live. And we have to decouple it from just the monarch.
Okay, one last question since we're getting up against time. If I have native milkweed infested with aphids, should I just leave it alone and not try to get rid of the aphids, or are there recommendations for that?
So I think the best thing you can do is mechanical control. Either mechanically you remove the aphids or use a stream of water. You can certainly use insecticidal soap that will kill other insects, including monarchs on there, but it's very time limited. You can cut it back and let the plant recover that way too. There's no great answer to that question, but mechanical is going to be probably your best choice.
Great. Well, thank you. We have quite a few questions left, but I assure you we will get those to Dr. Daniels and get some answers back to you as soon as we can. Thank you so much for doing this. I know this is just a hot button topic right now, so we really appreciate you being here and sharing this information with us.
No, it's my pleasure, and always a pleasure to work with you and the Florida Wildflower Foundation, Stacy.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you all. The recording will be available within a couple days, and we will get that link out to you as soon as it's ready. Thank you.